always nice.
So, yeah, they're kind of neat ones, but they put out. They put out.
It's a whole.
Yeah, so,
Oh, he does limited income and
they like to put
But what you would call.
as much people like to like.
I have a feeling I need Carla.
half for them. Nick and I were coming down to do something.
Yeah, that's what
There
we
was a gentleman, Bill. And I go, he wanted food. So Nick was dropping me off. We were running around doing stuff. Bill goes, I really need to know my shoes. And
It's just such a surprise.
Carla took his shoes off. And so I got these for my birthday for my wife. Oh, it's just
Wonderful.
yes, yeah, it was so neat. And then Nick and I took Bill to there's a motel on McLaughlin because we lived over that way. And he goes, I don't, and Nick got him checked in and stuff like that. And he didn't want to go in. And Nick said, well, I'll go in and make sure. So, because it was straight in, just a bed, and then the back was the bathroom, and there was a window. And he goes, well, what about that window? He was worried somebody might break in.
Oh.
And Nick checked and he said, no, it's locked, it's good. And he needed some clothes. And Nick had a jacket at home, and we had come home to get that. And I put it in a little bag, and he says, don't think I'm not appreciative of that, but a bag like that just is gonna be heavy for me to carry, because a little, like, duffel bag. But he said, the jacket's gonna be really nice. And so we gave him the jacket.
What do you think?
It's funny how we can remember him, yeah.
Yeah.
There it is, there it is.
Well,
But when I saw Carlo pick up his shoes, he didn't.
All right, we're gonna get started soon.
well, the timing was different on the, announcements.
So,
Which is maybe because I have a lot of.
You need to buckle
The
up
timing
a
was
little bit.
different.
Well, it said we weren't starting until 11. It didn't have,
No Sunday school hour.
Oh, on the calendar.
yeah.
Oh, whoops. Okay. Did I do that? Maybe I did. I don't know. Either way, I can cover this stuff again next week.
Look at you.
Yeah. So we're gonna spend the remainder of the year looking at the book of Daniel.
I got one.
So if you don't have a Bible, you're gonna want one. It's the literal. Okay. I'm back. I'm back. Had a good trip. Pretty uneventful, other than me getting food poisoning halfway through, which is a bit of a bummer. Yeah. We flew into Zurich. We have friends that live in Baden, Switzerland. Has anybody been to Switzerland? Yeah, it was my first time. Switzerland's expensive, holy cow. But Baden is beautiful. Baden means bath in German, and it's named so because there are a set of baths in the center of the city that you can go hang out at. I think they're modeled after the Roman baths. But it's gorgeous. It's in the middle of a valley, so there's Swiss
Are you ready to go back?
hills, mountains on either side, and it
Who's
looks very
working today?
alpine and all that jazz. So we spent 3 days in Baden visiting some friends. It's folks that I went to grad school with. Super nice folks. They have a 14-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter. And unfortunately, the 12-year-old daughter has been in the hospital since February. She got some kind of stomach issue, which they later diagnosed as a parasite. And they fixed that theoretically, but she hasn't been able to eat solid food since April. So it was good to see them, even in the midst of that real grief. But then we took the train to we kind of went in a weird zigzag. We went from Zurich to Avignon, France. My wife's family home is in Comps, C-O-M-P-S, Comps, which is nearby. It's maybe 20 minutes from Avignon. And that's where I got food poisoning, was in Avignon. We were walking around the city near the Pope Palace, the Palais de Pape, and I got an empanada from a street cart, and the rest is history. Yeah. Everybody else got chocolate chip cookies, and I wanted something savory, and I made the wrong decision. So then we were in Bronx until Monday, and then we took the train to Montbéliard, France, which is in eastern France, and saw my wife's. So we saw her younger sister in Bronx, we saw her older sister in Montbéliard, which was a lot of fun. And we ended up going to Kaisersberg, France. My favorite part of France. There are like 15 different little tiny villages that kind of orbit Colmar. They were all established by some German dude back in the 15th century as a way of defending this entrance to Germany or something like that. Anyways, so Kaisersberg is a tiny little, beautiful, gorgeous Bavarian town in northeast France that is also the birthplace of Albert Schweitzer.
Oh.
Yeah, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. Yeah. We were walking, we were exploring the ruins of the castle that are there, and all of the signs had Albert Schweitzer quotes on them. And I was like, man, they just must really love Albert Schweitzer here. And then we walked down to the city, and sure enough, there was a big museum, with his family home, and a nice little Protestant chapel, the only Protestant church in the entirety of Kaisersberg. Then we flew back Friday, and it was, other than Allen's Bay got delayed on the way there, because the flights were uneventful despite all of the TSA and air traffic control stuff.
How long did the food poisoning last?
About 4 days.
Oh.
Yeah, the immediate, symptoms, which I won't go into the gory details of, was about 24 hours, and then, but I had stomach issues until about Wednesday. Bit of a bummer. Put a bit of a damper on things, but. Ellen.
Did you take the TGV?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love taking the high-speed train.
That is
So is your French pretty-
Brian loved it.
Yeah.
What's
Is
that?
your French pretty good? Did you?
Not as good as it should be.
Did
Of
you
which,
have a lot of practice?
of which her family reminded me of several times. Jesse, why aren't you taking French classes anymore? I said, okay, fine, I'll start again. It's good. But apparently things went pretty smoothly. I know Paul Swanson's memorial went really well, so thank you. I'll reiterate the thank you during worship, and thank you to everybody that helped that happen. I know it was a big undertaking.
I didn't do it last Sunday because I couldn't remember all of our names. It was a real team.
Real team that showed up, yeah, with Matt the same. I'm putting it Mike. There's the the one kind of cool thing that we saw, we went to Luzerne, Switzerland. Has anybody been to Luzerne? Did you see the lion? Yeah, so the Lion of Luzerne. Matt, you too. Which fascinating history. It's a memorial to the Swiss Guard that were killed during the French Revolution, when the palace was stormed by the peasants, and there was like 50 Swiss Guard that were stationed there that got killed. And so, like 300 years later, some rich dude who was a descendant of one of the commanders of the Swiss Guard erected a monument. So it's an interesting history, but it's fascinating because apparently Mark Twain referred to it as the saddest piece of physical art he'd ever seen. And it's a lion that's cut into the side of a limestone or sandstone wall. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it's really striking. It's amazing what people can do with stone, because it's a lion who has been wounded and is basically lying down on his deathbed. Gorgeous. And 21st century, there was an influencer in the middle of the square doing some kind of aerobics routine on his cell phone. You can't make this stuff up. And he was like shouting and whistling, and everybody is just looking at him like, what are you doing here, you idiot? Maybe that was just me. Anyways, yep, and we made it back, and the dogs are happy to see us, so yeah. Yep. We're going to look at Daniel through the remainder of the year, and the reason is just coincidentally, over the past few weeks, I've had several people ask me questions about Daniel, and I didn't know answers. So this has been an opportunity for me. Yeah, we're going to learn together. This has been an opportunity for me to re-educate myself in the book of Daniel. And one of the questions came from our confirmation class, because one of the things I teach our confirmands is the kind of overall structure of the Old Testament. So we kind of have 5 genres of literature in the Old Testament, and that's how we we break things up. So you've got the Pentateuch, right? First 5 books of the Bible. You've got what I refer to as the histories, which is essentially Joshua up through 2nd Chronicles-ish. You've got wisdom lit, right? So stuff like Psalms and Proverbs. And then you've got major and minor prophets. And I was wrong, because I had, in my brain, had always assumed that Daniel was included in the minor prophets. He is not. He is one of the 5 major prophets, which I disagree with. I don't think Daniel belongs in the major prophets at all. In fact, I question sometimes whether Daniel is canonical, but that's a question for later. I am justified in that in the Ketuvim, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not even a prophet. Daniel is in the Ketuvim, so the writings. He is not considered to be part of the prophetic canon. So, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the history, the context, the compilation, the authorship, all that jazz. So today we're going to do background, and then over the next couple of weeks we'll kind of I might just cherry pick a couple of pertinent passages. Daniel has 12 chapters. And you can really kind of break Daniel into 2 parts. Chapters 1 through 7 and chapters 8 through 12, effectively. Paul?
I just have a question. I never thought about this. I thought, first of all, you were taking roles, what I first thought you were doing.
Oh yeah, Daniel, Paul. Daniel, Paul.
No, does he come from the tribe of Dan, or?
It's a good question.
You didn't find that out.
I did not find that out in my research.
Yeah, I never thought about it.
Well, so right off the bat, here's one of the interesting things about Daniel. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to when Daniel was written? Daniel is the most recently written book of the Hebrew Bible. Daniel was written in the 2nd century. 2nd century BCE. And it takes a little bit of time. So pinpoint.
Century BCE?
Yeah. So about 150 years before Jesus. Pinpointing the exact date of Daniel's authorship is tough, because it turns out Daniel was probably written over time, and written is a complicated word, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The prevailing theory regarding the authorship of Daniel is referred to as the cumulative theory. So here's the breakdown. There are 12 chapters in Daniel. The original text, if there's a grain of dirt at the center of this pearl, is chapters 2 through 5, okay, or 2 through 6. Okay, 2 through 6 is a collection of stories that most scholars would agree probably date to sometime around the 6th century, when Daniel the prophet was said to have been active and alive. Okay, this is where we get the fiery furnace and all the fun stuff like that. Chapters 1 and 7 are bookends on 2 through 6, and they are both later editions, editorial editions, that come in at some point. And then finally, chapters 8 through 12 are attributed to Daniel, but are stapled onto this original text some point even later than chapters 1 and 7. And this is really important stuff to know, because of how Daniel is often used in, since dispensationalism in the 18th, 17th century, how Daniel is often used for predicting the end of the world, for rapture theology, for all that stuff. And far be it from me to discredit works of our canon, but Daniel's a bit of a Frankenstein. Insofar as that Daniel, and I say authored in quotation, because Daniel is probably the work of several authors, but more importantly, several editors. And here's the really fascinating thing, and I'm waiting to hear back from my friends Anna and Ryan, because they didn't know the answer either. The question I asked them is, how the heck does Daniel actually end up in the canon, considering that the Septuagint, which effectively canonizes what we call the Old Testament, is written around the same time, or translated around the same time as Daniel is written. So how the heck does Daniel actually end up in the canon? And Daniel doesn't show up in all versions of the Septuagint. He's in about a third of them. And yet somehow by the time we get to the councils of, Trent and whatever in the late 4th century, when we affirm our canon, Daniel is a major prophet. And we're going to talk about all of that. But Daniel's written in the middle of the 2nd century, and again, written being a strong term. There are several authors, several editors who have their hands in the pot. And one of the fascinating things is Daniel, again, this flies in the face of the way that Daniel is used. Every chapter of Daniel begins with the author or the editor placing that chapter in a context, in a time. You'll notice if you just flip through the chapter, it'll say in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar in the year of blah blah blah, or in the reign of Darius and blah blah blah, or in the reign of Cyrus. Every chapter begins with that. And I would just point out right off the bat, this should be a really strong reason to not take Daniel out of context, because what happens with Daniel in terms of like rapture theology is people do this weird thing where they read chapters 8 through 12. Again, 8 through 12 being this section of Daniel that's kind of stapled onto the original stories. They read 8 through 12 and they read about these cataclysmic battles between light and darkness, good and evil, and they look at some of the language that Daniel uses about this will happen, and they try to do math on when that's actually going to happen, not realizing that it already happened. Whoever the author or the editor is responsible for Daniel 8 through 12 are, they were not concerned with the year of our Lord 2025. They were concerned with the year of our Lord 150 something before Common Era. And we're going to talk about that context too as well today. Any questions so far before I just kind of like steamroll ahead? Okay. So, a couple of, Paul.
Jesse, could you just say something about the context of that time, why consolation was such an important thing?
That's exactly, you segued right to what I was going to talk about. Yeah, absolutely. So there are two time periods to think about here. 2nd century, but also 6th century, right?
600s.
Yeah, 500s, yeah. What happens during the 6th century BCE?
Incredible exile.
The incredible exile, yeah, the conquest of Judea by Nebuchadnezzar II. One of my favorite names in all of history, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of kings, known of Babylon, and due to a series of unfortunate events, conquers Jerusalem, razes it to the ground, destroys the temple, and takes the people of Judea into exile in 589, 586, something like that. About 60 some years later, King Cyrus, the new king of kings of the Achaemenid Empire, the Persians, conquers Babylon, kills King Marduk, I think his name is, the last king of Babylon, and returns the Hebrew people from exile back to Judea and funds the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple. This is actually going to be very pertinent to the sermon this morning. We're going to talk a lot about the temple. And that's like 514, I think, is when the second temple gets built, somewhere in that ballpark. I should remember dates.
It's more than 1 year.
It takes a while. Yeah, the original temple took like 11 years. I think this one takes a few years as well too. So, needless to say, the 6th century, when Daniel, the original Daniel, who was a VIP, he was a person of very great importance, was alive and theoretically writing what eventually becomes the book of Daniel, he is operating during the most tumultuous time in the history of Israel, right? During this really traumatic and transformational experience. I cannot overstate the importance of the exile in terms of the identity of the Hebrew people.
Well, that's an understatement.
That's an understatement. Yeah, I cannot understand. Whatever. Jim.
So Daniel came from Jerusalem and was moved to Babylon?
Yes, Daniel was part of that the exile.
I saw an interesting line that reads, the difference between rural red America and urban blue, America resembles a cultural gap between Jerusalem and Babylon.
Interesting.
Not enemies, just very different worlds shaped by different realities.
That is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I kind of put the whole book sort of in context as I read it.
Yeah. And it's not,
In
okay,
today's world.
has anybody, who here has been to Israel, to Jerusalem? Anybody here? Okay, just me, all right. Okay, I'm gonna have to keep that in mind.
Sounds like a trip for a group.
Yeah, maybe not right now. Let's wait a few years. Jerusalem is big-ish. Modern Jerusalem is big. Ancient Jerusalem, not that big. You can see the old city, the old wall of David still exists. You can walk under it, explore it. Babylon was stinking huge. Babylon was absolutely massive.
Urban.
Yeah, it was urban relative to, this podunk town in the middle of nowhere of Jerusalem. Hanging Gardens, anybody familiar with the Babylonian Hanging Gardens? Yeah, one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world. So yeah, that's actually really kind of an insightful way of looking at it.
Kind of tied, Susan and I went from LA urban to Baker, Oregon rural.
Wow, you went the opposite direction. But but this is something fascinating to think about insofar as that, we think about the trauma of violence, right? Violence being done in the destruction of the city, but, we don't often consider the trauma of the cultural shift that they would have undergone. These people that have moved from their homeland now to this massive metropolis where they don't speak the language and the culture's different and they're affected, they're in this weird kind of limbo space of being slaves, captives, etc. The Book of Esther is great for kind of understanding how this all worked out. They had a really, the Judeans who were in exile had a really weird kind of niche in Babylonian society during their time in exile there, where they, really kind of straddled this line between being slaves and guests and whatever.
And to remind us that it's, we're talking 2-3 generations of people.
People that grew up, lived, and died, yeah.
Yeah, and to be away from the land, that is the basis of the whole promise.
It's one of my favorite quotes from Ezekiel, right? How can we sing our song in foreign land? Or is that Jeremiah? Whatever. How can we sing our song in foreign land? Yeah, I think it's Jeremiah.
Yeah. And I think that displacement is just hard for us to wrap our heads around.
Yes.
We have lived in a singular period in history of incredible peace and prosperity, despite the fact that we've had to arm ourselves to the teeth to do it. That displacement is really tough for us to get, unless maybe you're a minority within us and never felt at home in America.
Yeah. This is something that's hard for us maybe to appreciate, having not ever experienced displacement,
Yeah.
And not to get too far off in the weeds, this is kind of central to what's going on in the U.S. right now too. Is our inability to empathize with what it means like to experience displacement, being forced to leave your home country, your homeland, because you're not safe there anymore. Anyways, so 6th century is when Daniel is alive. Daniel is verifiably historical insofar as that Daniel is mentioned in Ezekiel, Ezra, and Chronicles. So 3 different books of the Bible that the name Daniel appears. He's in Chronicles. He's listed as Daniel, son of David. He was I mentioned a very important person. He was an administrator, a governor in the exiled community, a person of great authority and wisdom and all that jazz. So we know Daniel existed. I can't remember the date he was born. I should have written that down. He was born not too long before the exile, though. So he lives basically the entirety of his life in exile. Here's one of the tough things, though, is I'm pretty sure Daniel doesn't live to be like 140. And if you look at the headings of all these chapters, we hear mention of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar's successor starts with a B. It's at the front of the chapter. What is it? No, that's D. That's another really interesting historical idiosyncrasy. Belshazzar, I think his name is. Belshazzar.
Well, it says the palace in 1:7 there. It says the palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belshazzar.
Oh yeah, we won't get to that today. But this is another Belshazzar is Daniel's other name. But hold on, let me go ahead in it. Second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, King Nebuchadnezzar. King Belshazzar. Belshazzar is 2 or 3 kings after Nebuchadnezzar, something like that. Because there's like 4 kings. Anyways. So the thing is, and then it also mentions King Cyrus of the Achaemenid Empire, the Persians. And so if Daniel really was alive during all these time periods, he was alive for a long time. Is the short way of saying this. Because obviously Cyrus comes in at the end of things. Daniel had to have at least been 90 and still functioning. But we'll talk about that later as well too. 2nd century, Common Era. And then this is kind of the question, okay? So let's say that Daniel, in fact, did write stuff during the 6th century. He probably wrote a lot. He was probably prolific. I don't know that it was all prophecy, but let's say that 2 through 6, these chapters at the beginning are in fact Daniel's authorship. Why in the 2nd century do a bunch of people feel the need to turn this into a book, right? Turn this into a compilation. What's going on in the 2nd century in Israel? Anybody hear of a little revolt called the Maccabean Revolt? Yeah, that's going on during this time period. So what happens between the 6th century and the 2nd century is a series of new leadership, right? So you've got Nebuchadnezzar, conquest, exile, then Cyrus, he comes in. I think there's like four generations of the Achaemenids who reign. No, more than that. Darius is number 4. And here's the confusing thing: is it's not actually supposedly King Darius the 4th. King of the Achaemenid Empire. It's some random guy who's a Mede named Darius that doesn't show up in history, but theoretically was the governor in between the death of Belshazzar and the reign of King Cyrus. It's a little bit confusing. So you have the conquest of Babylon by Persia, Achaemenid Empire, and then you have the conquest of the known world by Alexander the Great, and then the reign of his 3 or 4 generals that kind of dissolves rather quickly afterwards. And then you have the conquest of the known world again by the Romans some 100 years later. And this all happens in between this and this, right? One of the most tumultuous, traumatic times in the history of the Hebrew people and the 2nd century. And again, use your imagination here a little bit, what that must have been like. To every 100 years or so, you've got a change in the world as you know it. And not just in terms of conquest, but in terms of culture. Someday, when I get my doctorate, it's never going to happen, but if I were to pursue my doctorate, the paper I would write would be on the transformative effect of trauma and conflict and culture change and the rise of myth. Because the 2 books that are written during this time period are the book of Enoch, right? One of the weirdest books that really isn't in our Bible, but it's in the Apocrypha, which tells the story of demons and angels and eternal conflict and battle between light and dark. And Daniel, which is the story of eternal conflict between light and dark and the end of the world and all this stuff. These 2 books come out of that time period, and I want to know what's going on in the hearts and minds of people who feel a need to talk about this stuff. I was reading an article the other day that was looking at the statistics of film genres over time. And there's an interesting correlation where you get a rise in horror and fantasy films during times of tumult, during times of conflict, which we're watching happen right now, believe it or not. This is if you are a horror movie fan, which Maxine is, this is your time to be alive. They're selling good, and you can imagine what correlating conflict is happening in our world that goes along with it. So that's the paper I would write. I would want to explore that relationship. So Daniel is authored, edited, compiled sometime during the 2nd century, sometime around the 150s. And again, the thing that's fascinating to me is that Daniel manages to squeak in the deadline for being part of the Hebrew canon, right? Because Daniel is in the Tanakh, it's in the Ketuvim, it's in the writings. The writings is, and the Tanakh is kind of the grab bag, right? So you've got the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and you've got the Nevi'im, the prophets, and then you've got the Ketuvim, which is everything else. and Daniel makes it in there. All I get.
Well, I wonder, is there a greater contrast between the Greco-Roman world and the Babylonian, Chaldean whole world over there? In terms of just what a human being is,
Yeah.
but the worldviews are absolutely so diverse that I'm not sure we have quite a period of transition or amalgamation of those two, or trying to make sense of what the dominative narrative is about what a human being actually is.
The eternal soul
Yes.
is an idea that arises during this time, or at least arises in the minds and the hearts of the Hebrew people. Not an idea that exists in their culture before this, but as Hebrew Jewish society comes into conflict with Hellenism, aka Athens, democracy, republic, philosophy, right? You have all these ideas that these people from this podunk country in the middle of nowhere, Near East, are suddenly having to digest. In a lot of ways, I think there's a correlation between what we're dealing with right now in terms of the information age and trying to wrap our brains around, the prevalence of media in general, not to mention social media and all of these news. I think, not to get on my pulpit, but I think a lot of what we're witnessing right now in terms of conflict, not only in the U.S. but on a global stage, is struggling to wrap our minds around a whole world rather than just our little corner of the world, right? And having news about France at our fingertips,
Yeah.
news about China, news about whatever, all these different ideas and concepts and philosophies and religions and cultures that are suddenly in front of us. They're not over there anymore. Jim.
To echo, sort of, in a time of conflict, there's resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And I sense that Daniel is showing faithful resistance, not hateful resistance.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. He's not fighting. He's submitting in a faithful way.
Yeah. The tough thing about Daniel too is it's hard to attribute a unified voice to the book of Daniel because you've got these really disparate types of literature that exist within the text, right? 2 through 6 is essentially a compilation of stories that date to the time of Daniel, right? You've got the fiery furnace, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then fast forward to Daniel 9 and 10, and you've got this apocalyptic literature of, again, good versus evil, light versus dark, the end of the world, common conflict, all that stuff. So and let's talk about that as well too. Do you know how we know that these are actually 2 separate, essentially, books that they're written in different languages? Really? 2 through 6 is the only example in the Old Testament that is originally transmitted in Aramaic. Everything else is in Hebrew. 1 and 7 are in Hebrew, 8 through 12 are in Hebrew, 2 through 6 are in Aramaic. Why? It's really fascinating. So here's something that you may not be aware of. Aramaic is what people spoke. Nobody spoke Hebrew. In fact, Hebrew was at risk of disappearing entirely during this time period because Greek, right, is replacing the mind space in terms of languages for a lot of people. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Near East, okay? Hebrew continues to exist as the religious language, so if you wanted to be a priest or whatever, you had to learn Hebrew. But by and large, if you were anywhere else except in the religious world, we're speaking writing in Aramaic. Right? So it's really curious that we have Daniel 2 through 6 is transmitted in Aramaic. Why? We don't know. Have no idea. But we do know that there must be two different, I mean, at the very least, these are written at two different time periods, right? Why, again, you don't get two things in two different languages. They're not two different things. I hope that makes sense. I'm mumbling my words. Yeah.
Is it, and this is just a theory, because they were taken to Babylon and therefore the language had to change? Maybe for perfectionism?
I don't know that there's any correlation with that. I'd have to look into it, but I would hazard a guess that if anything, the Hebrew people had to learn to speak Babylonian more than necessarily converting to Aramaic.
Babylon first.
Babylon first, yeah. It very much is. Yeah. You'd be shocked to realize that most of the great, the end of most of the great empires correlates to severe isolationism. Whether it's the Babylonian Empire or the Roman Empire, it's preceded by everybody turning their gaze inward and trying to put their own world first rather than everybody else. I mean, we've got.
It's called politics today.
Yeah. I mean, again, we talked about this when we were talking about the history of early Christianity. You've got the four emperors. Remember this? This precedes Constantine, and the guy whose name starts with a G that I can never remember. He literally, this is a direct quotation, wanted to make Rome great again. He thought that Roman blood was being diluted by foreigners, and Christians being the most visible example because they were Jews, right? It's a weird Jewish cult. He thought that was why the economy was crumbling, was because immigrants were diluting the blood of Romans. No correlation.
And so, I mean, this second century before Jesus, you still have the Maccabean
revolt
in the midst of the vacuum of power left by the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic generals, and it's just crazy how there's no settled anything for 3 centuries at least.
No.
In terms of, and so how does the Hebrew, this little minority of people that get stepped on this way and that way, how do they survive this?
It's actually pretty remarkable.
Well, and to me, that's the miracle of the Bible.
Yeah.
That this would somehow come through all of that decimation, all that genocide, century after century, and yet there are these Jewish babies being born and they're circumcised. It goes on.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Absolutely miraculous.
Yeah.
They are, if nothing, a hardy people, able to withstand great amounts of trauma. Yeah. And that's the other thing, I kind of alluded to it, but that's another thing that I think is really important to think about as we read through Daniel, is the correlation between trauma and this kind of stuff as well too. And it's not to me a surprise that, like, at the end of the book of Daniel, 8 through 12, you get stories about good versus evil, right? These big cosmic fights. Because during, having watched your entire world crumble not once but 3 times, you want to know that the good guys are going to win, right? And so when we ask the question, why, we can start to answer by saying, somebody thought that their community needed to know that good was going to win, eventually. Right? Because they weren't seeing it happen right now. I mean, the Maccabean revolt does not go super great. We can talk about that history a little bit next week as well too.
But again, when you think about messianic expectation, the whole thing is based on Maccabean messianic.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're so removed from that. It's hard for us to get a grip on how
it is
disorienting and upsetting this is, just in terms of identity.
Yeah.
Who are we and what are we doing here? Who is God?
And I would say too, this is very, very, very important because Jesus' world is completely shaped by this stuff.
Yeah.
Daniel, again, despite my frustration with the book of Daniel, is actually a really fascinating book to read because you've got to imagine this is only written 150 years before the birth of Jesus. this is the world that he inherits. This is the world that he's born into. Is the result of this conflict and all the stuff we're going to talk about in the sermon today. But, if you track the history of the temple, right, so destroyed in 587, whatever, rebuilt in 514. But then what happens, literally 15 years before Jesus is born, is Herod dumps a ton of money to essentially expand the Temple Mount by like 10 times, right? It goes from basically a square acre to 34 square acres, the Temple Mount, and all the buildings that are attached to it. He taxes the heck out of the people of Israel to do his public works projects, for which he's called Herod the Great. And Jesus is born into that, in that inheritance. That's one of the major arguments that is going on in Israel during Jesus' lifetime, right? Is who are we, and how does it relate to this building that we are still paying the debts on, right? We'll talk about that in my questions, but Warren.
So it occurs to me that the survival of the Jewish people is related to the same God that's our God.
Yeah.
And that Jesus' appearance in the midst of all of this conflict was purposely what God decided he was going to do, or it was going to do.
Yeah, one could definitely draw a correlation between the conflict that exists in the world and the inbreaking of the divine into the midst of it. I think that's a pretty insightful thing to notice. And, again, not to preach my sermon twice today, but that's kind of what that's about, isn't it? Right? Is how knowing that suffering is going to happen inevitably, not because we're special, but because we're human. To know that that's who God is, that's who God chooses to be somebody who suffers alongside of us. It's kind of important.
So, again, that idea in the New Testament of at the right time, in the fullness of time, this Savior is born, right?
Yeah.
What took him so long?
Yeah, I know, right?
It was horrible for 500 years,
Yeah. Expedite that process, please.
We have
I'm writing the names of some biblical works up here. Let me know if you recognize any of these. I don't recognize these first two, but you might recognize these last.
See, Paul,
Yeah.
what you said, it's sort of like, Daniel's a faithful resistance to, and Jesus is also a faithful, peaceful resistance. So they somehow echo each other on how they react to, if you will, evil.
Well, even if you don't consider it evil, it is just so mind-bogglingly disorienting, all the upset that is going on. How does the identity of Yahweh survive all that?
Yeah.
That's the incredible question.
It is. These 4 books are pieces of writing that exist in the book of Daniel in certain versions of the Septuagint. If you were to get a copy of the Apocrypha, you would find these associated with the book of Daniel, but they do not appear in the version of Daniel that is in our canon. Okay? Here's another interesting idiosyncrasy. And, I mentioned at the beginning, the prevailing theory regarding the authorship of the book of Daniel is the cumulative theory, essentially this idea that there's a core that has stuff kind of tacked onto it. These are books, anybody, Susanna?
Is that and the elders?
What's that?
And the elders, or is that a different story?
It might be. You might know more than I do on that one. Bell and the Dragon is another kind of cool apocryphal story. I'm not super familiar with either of these, but then again, as a good Protestant, I haven't read a ton of the Apocrypha, which I probably read at some point. But just, again, kind of adding on to our vision of the understanding of day almost becomes a little bit of a catch-all for maybe these stories that were kind of floating around in consciousness and got edited in. And I want to say something too. When we think of canonicity or historicity, we tend to get anxiety when we talk about this kind of stuff, right? Well, but I thought God wrote all these books down and gave them to people, No, this is actually kind of beautiful and fascinating, which is to know that, yeah, there was a Daniel, and yes, he prophesied, and yes, some of his words were recorded down maybe by his own hand or by scribes, and yet sometime in the 150s, a bunch of good Jews got together and took the core writings of Daniel and created something that answered questions or spoke to issues in their own time. We all the time. We do this all the time in the modern era. It just doesn't always necessarily end up in canon, right? So, I want to make a disclaimer, which is to say, in no way am I trying to devalue Daniel. Rather, the opposite. I want us to understand the value that Daniel has. Specifically, and this is the most important part, specifically because of how Daniel has been misused in Christian doctrine, okay? As this, apocalyptic prediction of something's going to happen sometime, right? Which is to say that when you do that, you take away the value that Daniel has. Because in my mind, the beautiful thing about this text, and Jim, you're kind of pointing to it, Paul said some words about it as well too, is it really does show us a people, a resilient people, struggling with conflict, trauma, and change. And this is a snapshot of where they were at during this time period and the stories that they told each other about God, right, that gave meaning and importance to the trauma and the change and the transformation that they were undergoing. Does that make sense? Does that track?
Yeah, and I would just want to emphasize again that the ongoing trauma of generations after
Absolutely.
enslavement and after genocide, and then for us to take that and not apply the story to Native Americans, African Americans, it just is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
How you could miss the point of this scripture as applied to people here in North America in the last few centuries. It's crazy.
It's hard to hear those voices when we're on top, I guess.
My point,
Yeah.
exactly, is that are we actually
Yeah.
faithful?
Yeah.
We Roman Empire Christians,
Yeah.
are we faithful to this story
Yeah.
at all?
I sense that you have an opinion on that.
I have a
Many
great
do.
question about that. That's all.
Well, and I want to, and last thing, and then we're going to read some direction to read some Daniel today rather than just talking. So I asked my friend Anna and mine about, if they had any thoughts on Daniel. And Anna very bluntly wrote back, she said, I really struggle with Daniel. Not necessarily because of the source text, but because of how it has been co-opted by so many different harmful theological movements. She's teaching at High Point University in North Carolina, and it's been a struggle for her because she was teaching at Luther Seminary in Minnesota up to this point, and they couldn't. Well, I am not going to rail about my alma mater, but they haven't been super faithful to the professors. Let me just leave it at that. She has had to go through a cultural shift of her own, which is she used to teach very self-motivated adults who were very interested in learning the material that they're being taught, right? As a former seminary student, I can say that literally everybody that I was in class with wanted to be there, right? This wasn't a class we had to check off our list to get our freshman credits done or anything like that. And now she's teaching lecture halls of hundreds of kids, and I use the word kids intentionally because 19-year-olds are kids. And from a much more conservative culture than she experienced. And so she has taught classes where she has brought in Daniel and has to deal with the theologies that we're talking about, right? Of Daniel should be read alongside Revelation and predicting the end of the world. Nope. Daniel and Revelation have zero things in common other than the genre of literature that they are. But that's a story for another day. So when I asked Anna, what do you think about Daniel? She kind of again, this is by email, I wasn't talking on her One of the interesting readings of Daniel that she has taught is that Daniel is and we've actually talked about this, Daniel is a really great text on the concept of identity. Okay? We're talking about the changing understanding of identity of the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, through all the aforementioned trauma, transformation, conflict, culture, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, as Paul mentioned, the plight of the African American peoples in our country is actually a really fascinating book to hold in tension with the experience of LGBTQ folks in the United States of America, especially trans kids, in struggling with the concept of identity. Daniel actually speaks kind of profoundly and raises this question: do you try to fit in or do you try to stand out? Which is, again, the Hebrew people trying to figure out in the 2nd century BCE, do we try to fit in or do we stand out? And it's the same question that Jesus is answering, 2 centuries later, is do we try to fit in or do we try to stand out? And Jesus gets crucified because he stands out. It's a different story for a different day. We'll talk about that as well too. Let's read. Flip to Daniel chapter 1. We got 10 minutes. By God, we're going to get through this. Okay. And again, pay attention to context here. Context is so important in this book. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar II, it's not in the text, of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave King Jehoiakim and Judah into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar, and he placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Okay, let's pause there real quick. How do we feel about that? How do we feel about that language of the Lord gave King Jehoiakim into his power? Whose power? Nebuchadnezzar's. Yeah. The text is pretty explicit here that the fall of Jerusalem is not actually Babylon's fault, it's God's. Seemingly. And this is a really important thing to think about and understand, because if we read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is dealing with the same idea. It's the question of what did we do wrong that God judged us in such a way. Okay, this is, I erased 5th, 6th century, but that's what's going on during exile, right? What did we do wrong, God, that you've done this to us? So at least in the minds and the hearts of the people, this is not necessarily the result of socioeconomics and politics or whatever. This is because they did something wrong and God is punishing them. Okay, doesn't mean that they're necessarily right, but this is where their hearts are at. He placed the vessels that were brought out of the house of God into his treasury. So Nebuchadnezzar took, theoretically, the Ark of the Covenant and all the other shiny gold stuff that was in there and brought those to Babylon as well. Yet another thing that's really fascinating to think about, how traumatic that must be, right? As much as the biblical witness talks about the importance of it. They would carry the Ark of the Covenant with them into battle to guarantee their win. They already got it lost once, right? At the beginning of 1 Samuel, right? There's that great story about the radioactive ark. It gets captured by the Philistines, I think, or something like that. And then they take it back to their place and everybody dies. Like they literally get radiation poisoning. And then they take it back. They give it back to them. They say, "We don't want this thing. You keep it." And God punishes them because they have the audacity to take the ark into battle. Like, what the heck do you think you're doing? So they already lost it once. Well, Nebuchadnezzar takes all the holy things, puts them into his treasury in Babylon, and nothing happens. No radioactive poisoning, nothing, which is yet further joy.
That's standard practice.
The standard practice is capturing the holy and wealthy things of your enemy as a way of having power over them.
You capture the flag.
You capture the flag, exactly.
Yeah.
Verse 3, then the king commanded his palace master Ashpenaz, I love these names, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility. So we have more hostages here. Young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace, they were to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. So what's going on here? Hostages, but also diplomats, right? These are the people that are going to be the intermediaries between Nebuchadnezzar and the Hebrew people. people that he could deal with, as contrasted with King Jehoiakim and his predecessor. Because remember, how we get into this is that the Judeans are playing the Egyptians against the Babylonians, and they lose. there's that all of the end of Second Kings is effectively, going back and forth between these two powers, trying to get a guarantee of safety out of one of them. And Nebuchadnezzar shows up before this and says, hey, here's the deal. I'm going to install a puppet governor. If you guys play nice, this is all that has to happen. And they kill the governor. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes in and is like, nice gloves are off. We're doing this now. Right?
It's also not a small amount of assimilation.
Yeah, it's also not a small amount of assimilation as well, too. So what do you do when you conquer people? You teach them the language and the religion. What did we do when we expanded steadily westward? We took the children of the native peoples and put them into boarding schools and erased their language and their religion from their brains and rewired them with ours. Well, that's what,
And their tradition.
and their traditions. That's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar's doing.
Yeah.
We didn't invent this. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine, on verse 5, sorry. They were to be educated for 3 years, that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, our titular character, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. From the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. This is where he gets that name from. Hananiah he called Shadrach. You can recognize these. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love those names. I love them. I think they're better than their earlier names. Your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your age, you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter. The only period of history when it's okay to be, it's not okay, only okay, it's desirable to be fat. If only we could return to that. They appeared better and fatter, I lost my place, than all young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw the royal rations and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. I'm going to read to the end here and we can talk for a couple minutes. At the end of that time, that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. Among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired them, and found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the first year of King Cyrus. For 70 years, Daniel now is the go-between between Babylon and his people. What's fascinating about this story, and by the way, this chapter 1 post-dates 2 through 6. So next week when we get into chapter 2, we're going to read through 2 through 6. Somebody felt the need to put this in basically as an introduction, right? So it does its job. It tells us who Daniel is, how he gets there, how he gets his role, right? All very important things. Do we do the same thing with our stories today? Absolutely, right? If you read any good book, there'll be an introduction, sometimes a preface, where the author or some wealthy, famous person that the author paid to write the foreword talks about how the book came to be written and all that stuff. Which is to say, this is just how literature works. So again, don't get scared by the idea that this is edited in later. It serves a good purpose, right? Okay. However, this is written in Hebrew. 2 through 6 is in Aramaic. Any questions? Anything? Otherwise, next week we'll really kind of dig into the meat of this. And I know that since I didn't really advertise that I did kind of advertise, but I know that the calendar item is missing from the calendar, letting us know this happened. I might recap some of this stuff next week just for the sake of folks who can be here today. All right, folks. 20th, 21st, Sunday before Christmas, we'll be done by then. Something like that.
What a floor we're standing on.
I know! Did anybody notice that the floors have been cleaned and waxed? And thank you to Mike Hegel for organizing that,
Yeah.
even though I tried to keep moving dates on him.
So what part of this are we studying next week?
What's that?
What part of Daniel?
2 through 6. I'll repeat that. If you want to read ahead, next week we're going to be reading 2 through 6. So if you want to read ahead, chapters 2 through 6.